Hi everyone, I'm making this video at the end of week 1 of the course, Origin and Destiny of Human Consciousness, and a week where we took something of a look at the question, what is consciousness? And hopefully progressing from what is a mainstream sort of scientific view onto the fringes of science and beyond, I guess, which seems essential, at least to me, to move beyond what the current scientific investigation of consciousness being too limited, essentially, and not really recognizing the nature of consciousness, probably results from scientists, in general, don't have contemplative or inner practices. They don't explore inside of themselves, science being inherently a kind of an outward looking. We're exploring the outer sides of things. Even looking at the brain, this sort of lump of grey matter is the outside of mind, if you see what I mean. Even if you cut the brain open and look at every single neuron, it's still the outside of mind. But the fact is that things have insides, and that is what relates to this thing called consciousness that we're talking about. And which you can never get there from this kind of outside look in. So we had to clear up what consciousness is, which we haven't cleared up, of course, because we don't know. But we've at least talked about it, and then alongside other words. So there are other words we have to take account of, such as mind, soul, spirit, self, higher self. All these kinds of words are they are inextricably sort of tied up with the word consciousness to some degree or other, and we cannot know what any of these things are really, at least in a concrete sense. So the use of these words becomes ambiguous, and you'll find people using mind and consciousness synonymously, or soul. Sometimes they'll use soul, sometimes they'll use consciousness, etc. And this isn't. It's understandable, but it isn't really. It doesn't help our thinking or our sort of progressing along in this subject to mix words like that. So while we can't know really what any of these individual words are, let's at least try to stay consistent in our uses, our individual usage of those words, so that you don't sort of let word uses sort of slip and become kind of so loosey-goosey that words become interchangeable. Just come up with your own personal sort of set of meanings behind these words, perhaps, or how you want to use these words, and then let's try and stay consistent. And when you use them, if you bring in the word soul, then say what you think that is as distinct from consciousness, or if you think it's the same thing, then say it's the same thing. So there's that. This subject that we're involved in is sort of fraught with this kind of thing, and there's really no way around it. What I want to say just a little bit about consciousness. It's a kind of probably a product of our worldview, that we're brought up in a worldview that where we're so used to objectifying things, to creating a world of things, that and then analyzing those or looking at those things as if we're separate from them, like the tree outside my window, for example. We're so used to that perspective that we don't really see what we're doing. When we talk about consciousness as an it, in other words, there's a tree, there's a chair, and there's consciousness or something like that. Consciousness is another thing that we can deal with objectively. That's a problem, because I don't think that that's possible to deal with consciousness objectively. I actually don't think it's possible to deal with anything objectively, but particularly true in the case of consciousness. So consciousness isn't an it. We can't make an it of it. We can't make it to third person. It's inherently first person. So we're in consciousness. We are consciousness. Then how do you talk about it as an it? Because the thing that's doing the talking is the thing itself, if you see what I mean. So consciousness is talking about itself as though it's an it, and it can't, and that actually can't be done. So so there is an inherent difficulty in talking about consciousness. This leads us to all of the problems that we see, the hard problem and everything else. So it is not a thing. Consciousness is not a thing. It is the thing maker. Consciousness is the thing that makes things. The very fact that I can say there's a tree there is because of consciousness. It's the creator of things. Who knows what the world really is really like, if there is such a thing. But consciousness is the thing that analyzes, divides this world into objects and things. We're using our consciousness that way. So to talk about consciousness as though it's a thing is blatantly problematic, and will lead us into all kinds of trouble. Nevertheless, we have to have some idea what we think it is that consciousness is, and what we think it is that's changing, at least. And that will be an ongoing subject for discussion throughout the course, I suppose. The other thing is, since we're dealing with the origin and destiny of human consciousness, unfortunately that brings in this word evolution. We all know, so it's the evolution of consciousness that we're talking about. And what does that mean? And that leads us into another whole mire of trouble. The word evolution comes from a Latin word, evolvere, I think it is, which means to unfurl, like unfurling a flag or unfurling a scroll that has text on it. So evolution is the unfurling of the scroll of life, if you like, something like that. Anyway, that's the origin of that word, the root of that word. And in our modern world, we've come to understand evolution. We tend to associate evolution with biological evolution, which came to us at least partly via Darwin. And we have a mainstream view of evolution. And you all, I'm sure, know what this mainstream view of evolution is. But basically, it's the view is that, first of all, that it is directionless. So there's this Greek word telos, T-E-L-O-S, or teleology, which means to have an ultimate end or purpose. Evolution in mainstream science has no ultimate end or purpose. It is a random process, to quote one famous evolutionary biologist, it's a random process going nowhere. It involves the random mutations of genes in a given species, and then whatever changes in the organism that those mutations cause they are selected for by this process called natural selection, or we used to call it survival of the fittest. So when a gene is modified, it changes something about the functional form of an organism. Most of those, the vast majority of those mutations will produce changes that are not good, they're negative, and so that modification won't survive. But once in a while, there's a modification that actually is advantageous in a given context or environment, and then that particular organism with that mutation will have an advantage and be able to pass on that trait to next generations, and it will lead to a modification of the species And with these small changes, eventually you build up changes to the point where you have this thing called speciation, where a new species has been created because the new organism modified with many mutations can no longer interbreed with the original one. So that's the process. But as described here, it's not a process that's directional. It can go in any direction depending on these mutations and the environment that selects for these mutations. So it's a random process going nowhere. So that's our mainstream scientific view of evolution. Right now, I mean, basically as we speak, if you dive into biological evolution, you'll know that there are modifications of this process, some quite significant modifications of this process that are already underway through things like epigenetics and evolutionary developmental biology and whatnot, gene expression. There's modifications of these. It's probable that what's called neo-Darwinist view, the mainstream view, will not survive in its current form, will be significantly modified. But whether it will be modified in order to provide a directionality to evolution or not, I don't know. When I studied biological evolution, it surprised the hell out of me because I realized that within the field of evolution biology, there are many different ideas, particularly with respect to this idea of telos, or their directionality, an ultimate end or purpose. And there were many different legitimate ideas. Some, you could arrange these ideas on a kind of spectrum. Some of them open the door more to directionality than others. And so I realized that even amongst evolutionary biologists, actually, it's not clear that everyone thinks it's a random process going nowhere. There are some quite legitimate ideas with evidence that would give evolution much more of a directionality, much more kind of open to the possibility of a kind of directionality. So anyway, that is, of course, biological evolution. And many would say, there are many people who would say that the idea that evolution is directionless is in kind of blatant contradiction of what's staring us in the face, which is that evolution has clearly gone somewhere. It's clearly progressed to more complexity, the complexity of interactions. There's the amount of and different kinds of interactions, diversity. Many of these things have had a direction to them over time. And so it's to say that evolution is random and directionless is sort of blatantly really not true. That's just ignoring what the obvious things that stare us in the face kind of thing. And it results from a really kind of a blind commitment to a physical materialist perspective on this. Anyway, regardless of where we go with that, we're involved with the evolution of human consciousness, right? And in this case, then the scientific perspective would be to look at it from something like the evolution biology perspective. What mutations have happened that have caused us to eventually have large brains? Since we've had large brains, how have they developed over time? How have our skulls developed? How have our use of tools developed? What about a use of language? All of these things have obviously evolved and changed over time. For the scientist, indicative of something to do with our consciousness, our degree of consciousness or kind of consciousness. So that's where that goes. And what we will see in our journey through this course is at first we go into Ken Wilber next week and the week after, and he tries at least to stick consistently, to be consistent with the science. he makes an effort at that. So he'll be going into what was the consciousness of early humans and that kind of thing, and using evidence to support his view of that, and then winding that clock forward. Although, Ken Wilber's scheme is definitely directional. So none of what we look at from here on out would be consistent with the pure neo-Darwinist view of evolution, that it's random process going nowhere. It's under Wilber, and then others that we study as we go on, it's not a random process going nowhere. It's definitely directional, and we'll go with that, basically. So Wilber sticks close to it, but once we're past Wilber, then there's really no attempt to stick close to the science. Rather, what the other versions that we'll look at, they use that version, that view of what's happening in evolution to question the science and say what we think the science isn't correct. And and then you'll get into the ancient civilizations programs and things like that, because under the assumption, sort of turning things around, that this is how evolution works and how it happens. Therefore, our view of ancient man, the current mainstream views of ancient man, must be wrong, and here's how they're wrong. So it'll go that way instead. So we'll progress forward. Anyway, we'll get into Wilber and next week, and we'll get that out of our system, and then we'll be free to fly free, perhaps, without being too constrained by current scientific views, which certainly do limit us. But we might want to sort of hold it in mind, how does this line up with the scientific view, and how could we, if indeed the scientific view is wrong, how could it be so wrong? Holding that in the back of our mind is probably a good idea. All right, I've enjoyed the discussion about what is consciousness this week, and hope it's all going well for you guys. And also in this process, I just want to emphasize, make sure that you, since consciousness is a first-person phenomena, then you have direct access to that first-person phenomena. So your own consciousness or access to consciousness will have changed over your lives. Keep that in mind as well. It's like, what's my own experience of the evolution of consciousness, or the development of consciousness been, or the access to consciousness? What's my own experience been? So keep that in the back of your mind as you look at these external ideas about it. You get a sense of how your own experience matches or doesn't with what we're talking about, both intuitively and intellectually or rationally. So that would be a useful thing to do.